Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
I now welcome scholar and multimedia artist Ashton Arnoldy, who completed a doctorate on Owen Barfield and Rudolf Steiner at the California Institute of Integral Studies and is now based at the Goetheanum. His talk is Reverent Impiety, Reading Steiner's Christian Cosmology Against His Racialism. Ashton.
Thank you all for being here. It's a bit maybe of a provocative title, but I intend it as, I'm thinking of it as a kind of intellectual service to the legacy of Steiner and anthroposophy, both of which I have a lot of love and reverence for. So hopefully that will be borne out. And so just to begin with some background, as Dan mentioned, I recently completed a dissertation on the work of Owen Barfield. And so I was introduced to the work of Steiner in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program through Robert McDermott. And I was initially very excited by Steiner as someone, as an esotericist who claimed to be sort of continuing the lineage of German idealism and especially the method of Goethe. But I was also a bit vexed by the allegations of him having articulated a racial doctrine. And so I sort of kept him at a distance until some point in my dissertation research where I finally heeded Barfield's consistent pointing back to Steiner if I really wanted to understand Barfield himself better. And so in 2020, I dove into the world of anthroposophy. And so when I say here that I'm offering this critique from an internal perspective, that's because I've been involved in a lot of initiatives. I've undertaken the spiritual exercises. I've listened to so many of Dale Brunswald's recordings of Steiner's lectures and read many of the books. So I'm coming from a sympathetic place. And I'm describing this as an analytical critique because I'm not offering it from any clairvoyant research, but from my healthy, hopefully unprejudiced reason, 21st century reason. It's been 100 years, as we all know, since Steiner passed away, and there's been some interesting discoveries, particularly in the field of genetics, that I think are important for us to consider when it comes to the possibility of disavowing the racial doctrine that Steiner articulated. Inconsistently, I think, is also important to mention. And actually, I think of that quote from Emerson whenever I'm sort of being neurotic about other people's inconsistencies. And so anyway, I just want to acknowledge that Steiner was inconsistent on this issue. And so I won't be, even though I will be drawing on the universalist Christian element to sort of think, I guess, against the racialist element, I won't be drawing on so many of those quotations. But so throughout the talk, I'll be delineating what I consider to be the ethical and epistemological implications of this critique. What does it mean if we are to disavow the racialist theory and consider it as a kind of error? What does it mean for our confidence in the methodology that Steiner offered and the sort of the almost totalizing cosmology that attends it? And then, as mentioned, I'll be drawing on the universalist dimension of anthroposophy to offer a kind of constructive path forward after disavowal. So this is emerging out of an ongoing academic conversation that involves Dan McKanan's great book, Eco-Alchemy, and as well Peter Staudenmeier, who's also been referenced during this conference. And so Staudenmeier points out one of the important reasons to address this and to maybe disavow the racial doctrines, and that is because not long after Steiner's death, because these occult doctrines were articulated as if they were just sort of spiritual facts that don't have political consequences, Staudenmeier argues they were then allowed to be appropriated by aggressive ideologies. And as has been also referenced, there were some among the Goetheanum leadership after Steiner's death and just anthroposophists that maybe weren't associated directly with the Goetheanum, who cooperated with and even collaborated with Nazis in their racialist thinking. And having been at the Goetheanum for the last 5 months, and I've met lots of inspired, brilliant young people, I've met a couple of whom are very persuaded by the resurgence of what we would call race realism, and think that Steiner's correct about the racial hierarchy that he describes. So it's still an issue today, and that's why I think it's important to address it. And then in his text, and it sort of informs the title of this talk, Dan raises the issue of what he refers to as Steiner's hermeneutic of reverence, which he recommended for students, of his students and just readers of spiritual texts in general, that one have this kind of mood of soul that makes one receptive to learning things that one otherwise wouldn't know, because this is a sort of like pre-modern conception of knowledge where it's recognized that knowing is a self-implicating, self-transforming process. But when it comes to certain things like the racialist theory, it might be important to bracket that or check that with a dose of anti-racist critique, and I think that's accurate. And you could say that here Steiner's in a kind of epistemological lineage with this emphasis on the hermeneutic of reverence. And we could say, even though wonder and reverence aren't exactly synonymous, it goes all the way back to Plato when he says, "Igar thaumasia afti psyche katastasis is ex ischeo philosophos genete," that philosophy begins in wonder. And so, but if our reluctance to question the teacher blocks the philosophical inquiry, well, then it stops there. And so, hence the reverent impiety. And so, just so that we're all on the same page, I have this definition of racism that I'm working with. You don't have to agree with it, but just so that you understand what I mean. Racism is premised on the idea that humanity could and should be divided into distinct biological groups. And for Steiner, he described physical biological reality as a kind of image or mirroring of spiritual processes. So I think that includes that kind of conception as well. And that different races stand in a ranked and hierarchical relation to one another based on criteria that are fixed and relevant for their behavior. So that kind of gets at this notion of essentialism, that, for instance, my white skin predisposes me to have certain capacities, and so on and so forth with other physiognomic features. But you might ask, are you saying that differences aren't real if you're denying that race is not an actual biological reality? And no, I think differences are real, but I think the notion of ethnos, at least if we look at a kind of historical transformation of the concept, is more explanatory than the idea of race. And so if you look back at when the word ethnos first started being used, it was just used to refer back in 800 BCE to different groups of human beings that were bound together by more than just blood, also by language, custom, shared history, by blood as well, but that wasn't the only thing that counted in kinship. And it could refer to Greeks and non-Greeks, so it didn't yet have the othering connotation that it would eventually take on throughout its history as a concept. And it wasn't, as far as I know, this is new research for me, so if you know better, please offer your critical feedback. But as far as I understand it, the notion of race didn't come about until the 15th century in the Spanish context, where it was used to refer to distinguish between recent converts to Christianity from Islam and Judaism versus longer-standing descendants of longer-standing Christian lineages. And then into the 18th and 19th century, it becomes secularized or biologized as referring to different sort of like subspecies of human, or maybe even subhumans. And then in the course of the 20th century, early 20th century, these ideas are at their heyday, you could say, when Steiner's thought is really maturing. But in the course of the 20th century, really starting in the mid-century, there's you could say a genetic falsification of the notion of race. There was a discovery that there's actually more genetic variation within populations than between them. And if race was a reality, even a spiritual reality projecting itself into the physical, you would expect that there would be clear boundaries between these different populations. And so this is new research for me, but as far as I understand it, that falsifies at least the biological theory of race. And so it appears more that we are one species and it's a gradient. And so I think, yes, I think there are differences, but the word ethnos, the concept of ethnos, also because it doesn't require this strict division of nature and culture where we're only defining belonging according to the blood. And so, and also we recognize now today that language and all these features that we would consider earlier in modernity as just cultural factors are also influencing the blood. And so, yes, there are differences. And so here are the 4 examples of racism. There's more you can find, but these are the ones that really stuck out for me that I just wanted to bring in this critique. So in 1912, Steiner says, take, for example, a people into whose blood this environment has built itself and try to graft upon such a people a new form of civilization. The thing is impossible. It is useless to demand from blood more than it can endure. So here there's a kind of essentialism that binds a people or an individual in like what they're capable of to their blood. And then in 1923, he says, the French are committing terrible brutality moving Black people to Europe. It has an enormous effect on the blood and the race and contributes considerably toward French decadence. The French as a race are reverting. So again, there's this implicit theorizing of racial differences, as well as an implicit hierarchy in that there's a concern that the French as a race could be regressing by association with Black people, that they're moving over there. And then the next example, he who ignores the great teacher, who rejects the great leader of humankind, Christ, will always reincarnate in the same race because he was only able to develop the one form. Thus, each person has the opportunity to push away the leader of humankind, or instead to undergo the transformation into higher races toward ever higher perfection. So here we have, again, articulated a racial hierarchy and also a description of reincarnation as a kind of progressive development that involves advancing into higher races if one is closer to Christ, which I would consider a very unchristian, just put it that way. And then the next example I have is from 1921, where he says, it was for the sake of bringing down the spiritual impulse that Christ became flesh in a human body. Man has his white skin that the spirit may work in the skin when it descends to the physical plane. Where it stays behind, it takes on a demonic character and does not permeate the flesh. There, the white skin does not appear. So again, another kind of essentialism where Steiner's tying the capacity to sort of actualize, and this is at least how I understand it, maybe there are other interpretations, but actualize potentials connected with Christ, which I would think would, for him, would be about love and freedom to white skin. And so just some grounds for disavowing these elements from Steiner's corpus. I think, as I mentioned before, race has been genetically falsified. It's a social construct that does have political consequences. So it's not like we should just pretend that race doesn't have any bearing in our reality, in our cultural imagination. And then as well, I think if it needs to be pointed out, it feels sort of crude to do so, but I think that the essentialism that I just described in that last list of quotes is just an example of essentialisms that are demonstrably false. I don't think white-skinned people are more capable of expressing these potentials connected with Christ than anyone else. And I just have this example from Anthony B. Thompson, his book that was written about the Charleston church massacre, and just this really moving display of forgiveness that he and others who survived but lost loved ones made. And I think of forgiveness as a kind of utmost expression of freedom and love. And then another reason I think it's important to disavow these elements in Steiner is that I think even if one gives lip service to honoring the individual, I think if we think at all with a kind of racial typology, that it will likely inhibit our perception of the individual, and as well our appreciation for complex historical contingencies like histories of enslavement or certain socioeconomic conditions that might be related to so-called race statistics that a lot of race realists will draw on to try and substantiate their claims about the essential characteristics of certain peoples. So, epistemology after disavowal, what are the kind of epistemological consequences for disavowing these aspects of Steiner's work? Because I think it sort of calls into question everything else. Thank you. And so I have this quote from my former professor and friend, Robert McDermott. While these unenlightened statements are truly regrettable, they could have the positive effect of helping some of Steiner's followers free themselves from the fundamentalist assumption that his words should be taken as unquestioned truths instead of progress reports to be continually. And even Steiner himself acknowledges in Cosmic Memory that spiritual perception is not infallible and that one can err. And I think this is a great opportunity to draw on the universalist dimension of Steiner's contribution and the way in which he is in a lineage of Christian Neoplatonist or Christian Hermetic thinkers, because he never put himself at the center of his methodology or his epistemology. He was consistently pointing to Christ as the divine logos, so the logos incarnate, the logos being this principle of intelligibility by which we can come to know anything. And so as one of his intellectual ancestors wrote, Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, imbued with his own qualities, the divine logos, like the clearest of mirrors, we are now visible only as reflections of the undiminished form of God the Word, who gazes out from within. So I think we can sort of fall back on this as really the heart of anthroposophy with a venerable history, and the means by which we participate in the creation of knowledge by making ourselves diaphanous to the world's revelation within our souls. And then finally, this text is really great by Matthew Rose. He's thinking about our contemporary situation where the liberal society sort of emerged out of a Christian milieu, where these ideals of universal justice and universal beneficence connected with the life of Christ and the incarnation and the crucifixion. This whole narrative background made sense of those values, and in our time where there's a kind of legitimacy crisis, it might be worth retrieving that background in order to continue to fight for those values. And so he writes, early Christian thinkers promised believers an astonishing consolation. Conversion to Christianity brought about a transformation in ethnic identity, making believers members of a family that stretched back to the dawn of human history. It included the idea that Christians formed a new genos, or ethnos. And then Steiner, in the same vein, in Occult Science, writes, as he says so many other places in different ways, the Christ concept supplied an ideal that counteracts all separation. Alongside all of our earthly ancestors, the common father of all human beings appears. I and the Father are one. Thank you for your time. That's all I have for you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.